is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. Continuing with our season's theme of death, I chose a poem today which is one of the better-known poems by the English writer Robert Bridges. Robert Bridges was the poet laureate of Great Britain during World War I. He was born in the beginning of the Victorian era, lived till the ripe old age of 86, I believe, dying in 1930. So he lived through a transformative era in history, and his own poetry is kind of transitional in its forms. On the one hand, he still uses more or less traditional verse structures, but some of his poems are written in a kind of loose, blank verse, which comes very close to free verse at times. Though he was not an admirer of free verse, he thought that it tended to formlessness. Some of his poetry does show kind of beginning awarenesses of the trends of literary modernism that we associate with T.S. Eliot and D.H. Lawrence and writers of that kind. So Robert Bridges is kind of a, bridge between Victorianism and the high modernism of the early to mid 20th century. Bridges also is acclaimed amongst admirers of poetry for preserving much of the poetic work of his friend Gerard Manley Hopkins, the famous Jesuit who wrote nature and religious poems in his own sort of idiosyncratic sprung rhythm. Bridges saved his work from loss or destruction or neglect, and did much to promote Hopkins' literary reputation after Hopkins died, a fairly young man. So Robert Bridges, his own poetry is very much worthy of study. I think that Bridges is a much underrated poet, but usually when people sing his praises, it's for the service he did to his friend rather than for anything that he wrote himself. Anyhow, this poem is entitled On a Dead Child, and I've been looking for the background of this particular composition, and I'm not entirely certain whether it's based on a real experience of Bridges or not. It could be, but not necessarily. It seems to be written from the point of view of a doctor, a surgeon, a medical worker of some kind. Bridge was a doctor by training, so there's a possibility that he was writing this from a personal memory, though it's impossible, at least for me, to prove. And he's reflecting on the body of a dead child. We don't know the child's cause of death, but he is trying to make sense of this horrible loss, this personal tragedy which has, claimed the life of someone far too young, and reflecting on the beauty of this child and, and also the fragility of life itself. So, On a Dead Child by Robert Bridges. Perfect little body, without fault or stain on thee, with promise of strength and manhood full and fair. The cold and star can bear, the bloom and the charm of life doth awhile remain on thee. Thy mother's treasure thou wert, alas, no longer to visit her heart with wondrous joy, to be thy father's pride. Ah, he must gather his faith together, and his strength made stronger. To me, as I move thee now in the last duty, Dost thou with a turn or gesture anon respond, startling my fancy fond with a chance attitude of the head, a freak of beauty? Thy hand clasps, as 'twas wont, my finger and holds it. But the grasp is the clasp of death, heartbreaking and stiff. Yet feels to my hand as if 'twas still thy will, thy pleasure and trust that enfolds it. So I lay thee here, thy sunken eyelids closing. Go lie thou there in thy coffin, thy last little bed, propping thy wise, sad head, thy firm, pale hands across thy chest disposing. So quiet, doth the change content thee? Death, whither hath he taken thee? To a world, do I think, that writes the disaster of this? The vision of which I miss, who weep for the body and wish but to warm thee and awaken thee? Ah, little at best can all our hopes avail us to lift this sorrow, or cheer us, when in the dark, unwilling, alone we embark, and the things we have seen and have known and have heard of fail us. One thing that is interesting to me in this poem is that Bridges has almost entirely kept his personal religious beliefs and religious dispositions out of it. It's not a poem that has, it has, I think you could say, maybe one solitary religious image. And that one is almost impossible to notice on a first reading if you're just kind of skimming the poem. If you take a very careful look at the, let me see here, one, two, three, four, five, six, what, about five stanzas in. Yes, five stanzas in, where he's disposing the body for burial, he remarks that, or the character in the poem, whether it's meant to be Bridges himself or not, remarks that he disposes the pale hands across thy chest. So he crosses the hands over the chest of the body, thus creating, you could say, the quintessential Christian symbol there, with the body itself. Though even that might be kind of a stretch. In any case, it's not a loudly or it's not a exuberantly religious poem. There's no reference to Christian notions of a resurrection. It's a contemplation of the body itself when the life has only just departed. I wouldn't run in the opposite direction and say that it's a materialistic or an atheistic portrayal of death, but there is something about it that where any sort of religious sense seems muted at the very most. Anyhow, it's a very delicate poem on a very delicate subject. I think it's one in which the form and the matter expressed in the form are very well suited to each other, and I hope that this has given you cause to go out and hunt down some more Bridges. I tend to prefer Bridges' short poems like this one, London Snow, and a handful of others. He was better known in his day, I believe, for some of his long pieces like Eros and Psyche, which is a poetic retelling of the Eros and Psyche tale from Lucius Apuleius. He also wrote a long philosophical poem called The Testament of Beauty, which has its admirers, few and far between though they may be. Anyway, I like his sort of short contemplative pieces like this one. And I'd like to read the last couple of stanzas again before we close. Thy hand clasps, as 'twas wont, my finger and holds it. But the grasp is the clasp of death, heartbreaking and stiff. Yet feels to my hand as if 'twas still thy will, thy pleasure and trust that enfolds it. So I lay thee there, thy sunken eyelids closing. Go lie thou there in thy coffin, thy last little bed, propping thy wise, sad head, thy firm, pale hands across thy chest disposing. So quiet, doth the change content thee? Death, whither hath he taken thee? To a world, do I think, that writes the disaster of this, the vision of which I miss, who weep for the body, and wish but to warm thee and awaken thee. Ah, little at best can all our hopes avail us to lift this sorrow, or cheer us, when in the dark, unwilling, alone we embark, and the things we have seen and have known and have heard of fail us. This has been the well-read poem. Thank you very much.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron-supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.